I see. So, to remove the extrinsic state in the flywheel pattern. Oh, hey, I didn't see you there. Come on in. Sorry, I promised somebody I'd do that. I've always wanted to make that kind of video intro. So now, seriously, we're actually going to talk about apex triggers and not the flywheel pattern today. And I don't understand half the stuff in that book anyway. I just keep it around because I feel like it makes me look smart. Triggers. All right, so here's what happened. I was making the second part in my intro to SFDX video where we were going to get into the trailhead trigger challenges. And I thought, you know what, we actually need to just take another step back and just talk about triggers and trigger syntax and the nuts and bolts and some of the features of the Apex programming language that are baked into triggers. I'm going to say, because I know when I was learning, they were very confusing to me. And I shouldn't say when I was learning, because I'm learning every single day. But when I was first trying to figure out an Apex trigger, some of the things that were confusing to me were really just features of Salesforce, features of the programming language. But I couldn't quite understand where some of these values were coming from. And I also want to demonstrate, so because I feel like I see a lot on LinkedIn or discussions that say, like, you know, the people want, I just want to write a, people say, like, I just want to write a simple trigger. And I'm going to go, but I feel like when somebody says simple trigger, what they mean is, I just want to do some business logic inside the trigger. And we don't ever do that, ever. It's the worst thing ever. And we'll talk about that a little bit. But what I want to show you how to do is how to do a simple trigger handler. And this, by no means is this an advanced framework. But I do want to show you, like this says, give you an idea of how you get business logic out of a trigger and into some sort of a handler that then does the decisions for your processing for you. So that said, let's take a second and let's just go over to the Apex Developer Guide. A big part of being a developer is Googling stuff and reading documentation. I'm sure that I do these two things every single day, many, many times. Lots of good stuff in the trigger documentation. Read it. And let's just start real quick. So a trigger is just something that happens, right, when the state of your database changes. And right, Salesforce is a database. It's, you know, a UI on top of a database. Something changed about a record, and that fires a trigger. And then we say when that trigger happens, we write code to say these are the things that we now want to do for further processing. Send somebody an email, update a related record, create a task. Those are all kind of the common things, common business cases you see a lot of. So triggers run in certain contexts on our on DML, and DML is data manipulation language. Very important term to understand in Salesforce in general, especially if you're studying for PD1. You need to know your different types of DML. You know, before insert, after insert, you know, update, delete, etc. So we have our values, and we also have, these are really important. So you have. And these are all baked in. So if you're going to see in the code, we're also type things like trigger.new. Trigger.new gives us a list of everything that is new in the trigger. And this will make sense when we start running the code. Trigger.new map, trigger.old map, and trigger.operation type. And trigger.size. All really, really important things to understand. Because a lot of times what we want to do in our handlers is compare the new data with the old. And say, hey, like, you know, did the only do this if the industry changed on the account? You know, then create a task, send an email, update something else. Only do this when a lead is closed and closed for the first time, right? I don't know, update somebody's commission. So these are all the values that we need to understand, the variables in a trigger, new map, old map, and how they work. So that's what we're going to talk about in this video. And I'm excited. Hopefully this is going to really help and make some sense to you. So let's start. I guess the first place to start is we're going to create a trigger. And Apex trigger, lead, and we're going to do it on lead. And homage to David Liu, because the first trigger I ever wrote was in his Apex Academy on the lead object. Okay, so I'm not going to add that to Git. So we just created a lead trigger, and we're just going to have it run on everything, right? These are all the different trigger contexts that could happen in: before insert, before update, before delete, after insert. So if any of these things happen, which is, anyway, these are all the different ways our database can change, this trigger is going to run. So because it is a trigger on lead, it's always going, when we look at those other values, so not debug, let's say the values in trigger.new are plus trigger.new. The values in trigger.new, so this is always going to, trigger.new always gives us a list, and it always gives us a list of the S-object type that this trigger is declared on. So trigger.new on a lead trigger is never going to give us a list of accounts. It's never going to give us a list of opportunities. This confused me, one, because I'd see this and I'd be like, where the heck did trigger.new come from? Because you were so used to, right, seeing everything else, right, like, string name equals Brooks. All right, that's mine. I never saw anybody do like, trigger.new equals. It's a feature of the language. So I'm going to say this is I'm going to steal something like automagical. This is just built in for you. So this is in the trigger class. If you read the documentation, this is something that is happening when the trigger class in Apex runs. So Apex is providing these values for us. So if we wanted to say system.debug, so we're just going to look at we're going to create a lead here in a second. We're just going to look at the values that come into into the trigger. The values in trigger.oldMap are why is that being highlighted in red for me? What did I miss? System.debug values in trigger.oldMap are. Oh, how'd I put a? Not sure how I got an underscore in there. Okay. And so remember, old map, the maps, new map and old map, always going to give us back a map of ID to S object type. So if the lead is Brooks Johnson and my ID is 1, I'm going to get a map back of 1 and then all of the fields on the lead object for Brooks Johnson, right? System.debug. And let's say we want actually the trigger type is operation. We actually want trigger.operation type. And last, just to show it, let's do the values in trigger.old are trigger.old. So remember, new and old are going to give you lists, and old map, new map are going to return maps. Pretty easy to remember, I think. And let's open up our anonymous Apex. We're going to just create a lead. We're going to create a lead just for test data to play around with, and then we can see what sort of values hit our debug statements. So lead L equals new lead, and I always forget what are the mandatory fields on a lead. I think last name. So equals, say, Johnson, and company equals, I'll say Cervello, because I work for Cervello, a Salesforce partner. All right, so we are going to, and then what we need to do is we need to insert that into the database. insert L. All right, let's just go. We just clear that out and get our debug statements. And you know what? Nothing's going to happen because I'm using a scratch org and I didn't push my metadata up to my scratch org. So all this code that we wrote so far, pardon me, only existed on my local machine. And you cannot run, there is no such thing as running Salesforce locally, right? Salesforce does not run on your local machine. Apex does not run on your local machine. Let's run that again. Awesome, success. So the values in trigger.new are, and we could see, hey, we got a lead with last name Johnson, company Cervello, etc. The trigger type was before insert because that was, we just inserted a new lead into the database. We also see an after insert trigger also ran. So every time, like we do, because we inserted something. So if there were things that we wanted to do before insert, and then if there were things that we wanted to do after insert, fundamentally, I'll say, always prefer a before insert trigger. After triggers are generally, you need them, you'll use an after trigger if you need to access the ID. So if I then needed to do something where I needed the ID off this lead, then I would need to do an after trigger. But I would say always default to a before trigger, and if it doesn't work, then switch over to an after. But that's the biggest thing, is if I need that lead's ID for some reason, I need to wait till that lead has hit the database, Salesforce has given the lead an ID, and then I can start to do other things with that ID. I can't access that ID before Salesforce has assigned it. And also we see here the values in trigger.old map are null because no previous version of this lead exists in the database. But now let's get rid of everything else we're going to do. For now, we're just going to update. So we're going to say lead L equals, and I'm going to write quick select last name. You know what, we're going to get first name, company, from lead, and because we only have one lead in my scratch org, limit 1. All right, now let's just say we're going to update the lead, L dot, because I didn't give it a first name, I didn't give my lead a first name, I'm going to give it my first name, equals Brooks. Update L, run that. So now you can see we're in a before update trigger. And now we have values in trigger.old, trigger.new, old map. And let's just get that out of the way. We're going to expand this a little bit just so we can look at them, all right? The values in trigger.new, right, are first name Brooks, right, last name Johnson, etc. But if we look at the values in trigger.old, first name is still null, because so we can now compare. If we needed to do logic where we would say, hey, only do something if the lead's first name changed, what we're going to do, and we're going to show how to do this in a little bit, is we compare the values in new or new map to the values in old and old map and say, if first name changed, then do this thing, or any other field that we care about. We're going to just keep this as simple as possible today. And then you can see also an after update ran. So if there was something I needed to do in the after update context, because we updated a lead and before and after both ran. Now, next up, so here's what I feel like I see happen a lot when people say a simple trigger. This is what I think people kind of are thinking of. So we're going to say for lead L in trigger.new, and then we're just going to do a system debug. We do stuff in our trigger, and we'll just see. We'll just see the. We'll go look through the is. So we can just see the leads in our loop. There should only be one anyway, right? All right. Let's bring back our anonymous apex a little bit. And first name equals James. Why not? And I didn't push this up again, did I? So nothing's going to change. 1 second. I'm going to change that to Lewis. All right. And so you can see now we are, I'm going to give us some space again. Should just make this its own window in the next video. In trigger dot, the lead in the trigger is, and we can see it's me with my ID. And now we're going to do stuff in our trigger. This is bad. Bad. Don't do it. Don't ever do business logic in your trigger. It turns into a mess. Then your next one, it turns into a giant pile of spaghetti code that is impossible to maintain. And another real goal of code, and especially in any object-oriented programming, is code reuse. The code that we write inside a trigger is only accessible in that trigger. I can't call it from another class, use a method, anything like that. And then, next when somebody's like, hey, you know what I also want when this happens on a lead, now all of a sudden you start to have 1,000 lines of for and if, and it's a mess, and nobody knows what's happening. So, off my soapbox, we just don't do that. We do not write business logic in our triggers, and we only ever have one trigger on an object. We don't have 3 different triggers on our lead object. That happened in the very early days of Apex, before there were classes and triggers were it. That was way before my time. I want to say, I don't know, it's got to be at least 15 years since that was the case. So, don't do it. All right, what we're going to do, I'm just going to delete that because I don't even like looking at it. And we are going to create a trigger handler, Apex class, lead trigger handler. All right. And I'm just going to, by no means is this a sophisticated trigger handling framework. I just want to give you an idea of how to approach these problems instead of putting business logic inside your trigger. So let's just, so we need to create a constructor, and we are going to say it's going to get a list of leads. We'll call that the new list. A map of ID to lead. And, we'll use that for the old map. We're not going to mess with trigger.newMap in this one, but you would do it the exact same way. And list, lead, old list, and what else? We want a map, ID, lead. No map. And our last one is, whoops. All right. We need a trigger operation type. Getting a little long here. Okay. So when we create this lead trigger handler, we're going to pass these values into it. And then, we will just do a Before we do that, we are just going to let's just do a system debug, make sure everything works in the lead handler, and we'll just type and system debug. Let's say trigger new equals, all right, we got to add a plus there, new list. Okay. And let's go back to our lead trigger. Lead trigger handler equals new. So what we're doing here is we're creating, if you remember back to the video on static versus instance methods, we are going to create, inside our lead trigger, we are going to create a new instance of our lead trigger handler. And we are going to give it, I'm going to, because I sometimes forget what I type, so if I hit Control P on my editor, Illuminated Cloud, it tells me the parameters it's expecting. So remember, it needs the trigger.new, so we're going to give it trigger.new, trigger.oldMap. Oldmap. Trigger.old. New map. And all right. Now let's push that up. We got a problem here. So what is... because we want not trigger operation, trigger dot operation type. Okay. Back to anonymous Apex. Change it back to my first name. Run. All right, so we are now in the handler, right? So, and we're past it. We gave the handler all those values. So now, instead of doing anything inside here, we just created a lead handler. We gave it the, so trigger dot, so this is something that really confused me. Trigger dot new on a, say on a lead trigger is exactly the equivalent of a list of leads. Trigger dot new map is exactly the equivalent of a list of a map of ID to lead when it's a lead triggers. Same difference if it was on account, contact, opportunity, campaign, etc. It took me a while to wrap my mind around that. So remember that trigger.new on the is the same thing as a list that's going to contain the S object that the trigger was declared on. So now, because I don't want to get into a real advanced constructor, but let's just say we're going to do a switch statement, which is kind of cool. I don't feel like it's a fairly new feature in the Apex language, and I don't feel like I see it used maybe sometimes as often as it should be. So we are going to switch on type when before update. All right, so when it's a before update trigger, and you know what, so let's go down here. First, we're going to just create a method. We're going to make it private inside our handler. Private. It's not going to return anything for now. we'll say, you know what, we're going to call this is first name changed. And this method needs a list of leads. I'm going to call it the new list. And I want it to get a map of ID to lead. All right, so first let's go back up to our switch statement. And we'll say, is first name changed? And we are going to give it new list, old map. I wouldn't really do this in the constructor normally, but to keep this video simple, that normally we would probably assign these to member variables, instance variables, and do the processing from there. But I just want to keep this simple to show how it all works. And we're going to do the old map. Okay. So now when this trigger fires, we're going to go into our switch statement. And it's going to say, hey, if this is a before update trigger, call the isFirstNameChanged method and give it the values of new list and old map. And if you remember, right, if we go back to our trigger, those are trigger.new and trigger.oldMap. Trigger.new is what? It's a list, right, of the S object that trigger exists on. Trigger.oldMap, map, ID, S object type that the trigger was declared on. Exactly the equivalent of a list of leads and map of ID to lead. I feel like I'm beating this into the ground a little bit because I just couldn't wrap my head around it when I was learning how to work with a trigger. All right. Now, here's the cool part. All right. We only want to do this if somebody changed the first name. All right. So we'll say for lead L, we're going to make a for each loop in new list. Because remember, we're getting a new list as a list of leads. That's trigger.new. Put our curly braces. Because we're going to say, if, for this lead. Now, but here's the magical part, right? Because we need to compare the old value. And this is where maps are awesome. All right. Lead, old lead is going to equal old map dot get. All right. And you can see, so my editor's telling me, so the key here is the ID. So what I'm going to do, if I go L.ID, and let me just take a minute to make sure. So we have in our for each loop, we've got the one lead that's going to come through and triggered in our trigger from the new list, trigger.new. And then we are going to say, hey, the old lead, we're declaring a new lead, and we're naming it old lead, and we are setting it equal to the value of old map, and the map method has, the map class has a method of get, and it takes the key. And so we're giving it the key of the lead ID that is currently in the loop. And it is then assigning the value of that. So I'm going to put a debug statement in here too, just so we can see that. Because we're saying, let's just say we had 200 values in old map. We're saying old lead is going to be the value of the lead that has the same ID as the one in trigger.new. And this is what lets us compare the new value to the old value. I hope that makes sense. It's a critical skill to have, is to be able to compare data. And it's definitely took me a little while to figure out how this worked. So now we want to say if, right, do an if statement. We'll only want our processing to happen if the lead in trigger.new has a different first name than the lead in the old map. If L dot first name, we're just going to use dot notation to traverse the fields on our object if l.firstname is not equal to old lead dot firstname, and we're not actually going to do anything in here. We're just going to, we'll say system.debug, send out an email about the name change policy. Because what we really would do here, right, you wouldn't want a method that, if you named a method, is first name changed? That's the only thing that method should do, honestly, is check to see if that condition is true. If it is true, then it would call another method to send the email. You don't ever have methods do one thing, and they should do that one thing very well. They should not ever do two things or three things. If you find your method doing two things, break it up. Break it up. It should be two methods. A rule of thumb, I would say, if you're starting to find yourself indenting 3 or 4 levels deep, your method's probably doing too much. All right, but let's, off my soapbox about clean code. Let's push that up. All right, back to Anonymous Apex. And tell you what, it's my son Arias. And let's see, in the lead handler before. There we go. So we got that. It went into the, let's minimize that. We're going to expand up. So it went into the before update. It called down to that method. Remember, it used our switch statement. Said, hey, if this is a before update lead, do this thing. And then it went in, and so we could see, here the value, the new lead, right, had a value of Arias. The old lead had a first name value of Brooks. And we said, if those two things are not equal, then send out an email about the name change policy. If we, just to show you again, let's back to, we already had Anonymous Apex open, right? So, and if I just say last name equals Jones, nothing should happen because our first name did not change, and that if condition that we wrote isn't looking for a change on the last name. So we should not see that send out an email about the name change policy show up in our debug log. And expand that out. There you can see. No tricks up my sleeve. That did not fire our processing condition because it was not met. So let's just take a real quick. Okay, so we have our lead, our lead trigger, right? These are our DML events that this trigger will happen on. We don't write code inside our trigger. Well, I shouldn't say we don't write code. We don't write business logic. We want to write a handler of some sort. The handler is always going to pass these values, trigger.new, old map, etc. Everything I showed you in the documentation. These don't have to be declared. They are a feature of the language. So anytime you write a trigger, the trigger class comes with these. Then we called the lead trigger handler, and we sent those values to it. And then we did a switch statement on the type. We said when the trigger type is before update, call the isFirstNameChange method, give it the values in trigger.new, give it the values in trigger.oldMap. The lead in the for each loop equals the, so if we had 100 leads in trigger.new, it would go through each one of these. So the first lead in, then the second lead, etc. And say, hey, you know what now? Old map, trigger.oldMap. I want you to give me the value of the lead that has the ID that is currently in the for each loop, and set that equal to a variable named old lead. And then we compare them. if the lead that is currently in the loop, if their first name is not equal to the first name value that we had previously on old map or old list, then do something, right? And this is the most basic kind of pattern you're going to write. If get the data, if something changed, then do this. So whatever field, whatever object, this is kind of the fundamental trigger handler pattern. So I'm gonna, I think we're gonna wrap it up there. This was long, lots to take in. I really hope this was helpful, and if you made it all the way to the end of this, congratulations. Take this code, play around with it. Please take a second and hit like and subscribe. Definitely helps me out, and it makes me feel good about myself that somebody cares about these. And I'll see you in the next video. Take care, everybody.